if the president decided to use military force, would it fundamentally alter the key dynamic? That is to say, will it change the balance of power between the regime on one hand and those who are protesting in the streets? Most analysts and experts that I talk to raise serious doubts and questions about whether or not airstrikes, even if they went after leadership targets, could fundamentally alter the repression that's now underway, let alone create a disruption or division in the regime that could somehow lead to some sort of alternative. Final point, Maxime. The problem here is that the protests are leaderless, directionless, and are not well organized. If, in fact, military action was taken and the regime did fracture, you'd probably have elements, armed elements of the regime, the Basij, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the military, maybe fighting with one another. And the question is, what kind of regime would actually follow? A regime that you and I would describe as democratic is not likely to be the immediate consequence of the fall of the Islamic Republic, partly because there is no alternative leadership among the protesters that has the legitimacy or the power controlling the money, the guns, the oil.
How could events in Iran evolve? What potential geopolitical risks they can lead to, and will Trump strike Tehran? All of this I am about to discuss with well-experienced American diplomat who served 6 secretaries of state as an advisor on Arabi-Israeli negotiations, Aaron David Miller. Thank you for being here, Aaron.
It's a pleasure to be here with you, Maxime.
According to different reports in international media, US moves aircraft carrier strike group from Asia to Middle East. What can it indicate?
I think it indicates that President Trump has made a decision, at least, to not to decide, to keep all of his options open. And I think there are a couple points to keep in mind here. Unlike any of his predecessors, Donald Trump has responded in a very risk-ready fashion to protests and demonstrations in Iran. He has said things that no American president, Republican or Democrat, has ever said in an effort to encourage the protesters. And while that, I think, has heartened some, it has raised a significant issue, because along with encouraging them, he has basically committed the office of the presidency and his own personal credibility by making statements like, we're going to hit them hard if the killing doesn't stop, or help is on its way, or seize your institutions, to the demonstrators in the streets. And it raises significant issues about whether or not his words are going to be accompanied by deeds. I would only say, and there's some resonance here for Ukraine and other societies there that are faced with authoritarian pressure, and in Ukraine's case, an invasion by Vladimir Putin, that if in fact you're going to encourage demonstrators in the streets who are unarmed to go out into the streets and to face a regime, in this case, the Islamic Republic, that has no compunction whatsoever for killing indiscriminately protesters, then don't you have a moral or ethical obligation to support them? This raises a serious question. The other issue, of course, is if the president decided to use military force, would it fundamentally alter the key dynamic? That is to say, will it change the balance of power between the regime on one hand and those who are protesting in the streets? Most analysts and experts that I talk to raise serious doubts and questions about whether or not airstrikes, even if they went after leadership targets, could fundamentally alter the repression that's now underway, let alone create a disruption or division in the regime that could somehow lead to some sort of alternative. Final point, Maxime. The problem here is that the protests are leaderless, directionless, and are not well organized. If, in fact, military action was taken and the regime did fracture, you'd probably have elements, armed elements of the regime, the Basij, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the military, maybe fighting with one another. And the question is, what kind of regime would actually follow? A regime that you and I would describe as democratic is not likely to be the immediate consequence of the fall of the Islamic Republic, partly because there is no alternative leadership among the protesters that has the legitimacy or the power controlling the money, the guns, the oil to actually seize and maintain power.
Should Iran count on China's support in such circumstances?
I doubt it. I think the Chinese are concerned, given the fact that Iranian oil is their largest, I think, in addition to Saudi, who are the largest importer of oil. I don't think the Chinese are in any position, other than diplomatically, if this became a Security Council issue, to affect matters there. They have no military presence to speak of in the region. And the Chinese, frankly, are not interested. Xi Jinping is not interested in becoming involved in regional conflicts. His strategy is to maintain contacts and goodwill with as many different parties as he can at the expense of the United States. So on this one, I think the Chinese won't have much of a role to play. And I would anticipate your next question. Vladimir Putin. Putin's got to be extremely careful here, because what matters to Putin is Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. He cannot afford to alienate Donald Trump. And if he came to the support of the regime, and this regime does have close relations with Russia, they supply drones and technology in Putin's murderous war against Ukraine. I think Trump, this would not help Putin's case. It would be a distraction. And frankly, I'm not sure the Russians have the capacity, given what's happened in the Middle East, the fact that the Assad regime has now fallen, to play a meaningful role in an effort to involve themselves in this conflict.
In your opinion, what could stabilize situation and save current regime?
I think that the regime will be saved as a consequence of its own repression and the fact that the protesters simply don't have the means to oppose it. I don't think, unless the administration literally was to wage a major and sustained campaign to destroy economic infrastructure, leadership targets, what remains of Iran's ballistic missile capacity, strike its nuclear facilities again, to really go to war with Iran. And I'm not entirely sure that would produce the outcome that we want. We want a transition to a regime that is stable, democratic, and is representative of the Iranian people. And I don't think those sorts of regimes or outcomes can be produced by military action. One only would have to look at the American experience in Afghanistan after 20 years, the American experience in Iraq. Yes, Iraq is better now than it is under Saddam, but it is not a polity that is all that stable and democratic, to be sure. And then there's Libya, where the fall of Gaddafi, NATO and American intercession ended up not producing the results they wanted. So you can't change a regime from the air. You can undermine the forces of repression. Maybe you can give the regime second thoughts to move toward additional repressive measures, but you can't change it.
Yeah, Iranian officials stated that they were ready for both options, negotiations and for the war with USA. I would like to ask you how this potential war could look like.
I think it's very fraught morally for the United States to enter into a negotiation on the nuclear issue in an effort to preserve a regime that is now killing innocent protesters. And any negotiated deal on the nuclear issue would involve sanctions relief on the part of the United States. That's even more morally fraught because we would be essentially supporting and reinforcing an authoritarian regime that is repressing its own citizens. So I don't see any prospect of a negotiation. It is interesting, though, to raise the question, given what Trump has done in Venezuela, which is essentially to take Maduro and his wife offline and prosecute them for narco-terrorism and facilitation of narcotics. But the Trump administration, clearly, there's a report this morning that CIA Director Ratcliffe was in Caracas dealing with the regime. That regime is still very much authoritarian and Chavista in character. Could Trump undercut the protesters and undercut the potential for democracy in Iran by essentially cutting a deal with the current regime on the nuclear issue? I think that's probably very unlikely.
When it comes to a Middle East region in general, I mean, to what implications in the Middle East, in this region, could lead the falling of Iranian regime, and what potential risks and maybe benefits do you see?
I mean, the collapse of the regime, if it ended up creating something more stable, and remember, many Iranian experts predict that the successor regime would be more hardline, that you'd see a shift from the malacracy, from the mullahs, to control by the security and intelligence services and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. This could create an even more radical Islamic Republic. I see only benefits if, in fact, the regime fell and it produced a stable successor, a constitutional monarchy, anything that was more representative of the Iranian public. I think it would have a huge impact in Lebanon, where Hezbollah could no longer count on the $1 billion a year that the Iranians provide. I think it would further weaken Hamas in Gaza, and it probably would free up the Gulf states because of their security concerns over Iran. Possibly free them up to be more flexible, perhaps, in cutting an agreement or negotiating an agreement with the Israelis. Although I have to add a cautionary note there. I think Saudi requirements for normalization with Israel will have to involve something significant for on the Palestinian issue. So I'm not sure the collapse of the Islamic Republic would completely free the Gulf states, but it would certainly relieve an enormous amount of pressure, and would also relieve the burden on the U.S. military, which is largely deployed in bases in CENTCOM in Bahrain, in Al Dhafra base in the UAE, and in Al Udeid in Qatar, and it would reduce Iran's troublemaking capacity worldwide as well. All in all, it would be a positive development, but we are very, very, very far from the prospect of the kind of regime that I'm describing coming to power.
Do you see any scenario, I would say the worst case scenario, which can lead to global conflict?
I can see regional conflict. I can't see global conflict. If the Trump administration decides to strike and the Iranians respond, either by striking U.S. bases, and remember, geography, Maxim, in the Middle East is destiny. The UAE, Saudi, and the Qataris are literally living next door to one another. So the Iranians could respond as they did in September 2019 and strike Saudi oil producing facilities. They could decide to strike Israel. We've seen that in 2024 and again in the June war this year. So regional conflict, yes. Potentially global conflict, no.
Okay,
I'm going to have to run.
Yeah, one last question. In the long term, what lessons from past diplomacy with Iran should the United States apply to crisis management, alliance cohesion, and preventing miscalculation in escalatory moments with other regional actors?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, as long as the Islamic Republic is a regime, authoritarian regime which represses its own people and wants to gain influence in at least 4 Arab capitals and paints its adversaries by saying death to Israel, death to the United States, I think it's extremely unlikely that the U.S. could do what I would describe to you as transformational diplomacy. But it could do transactional diplomacy. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that the agreement that was entered into by the Obama administration in 2015, really did put a cap on Iran's nuclear aspirations, however temporary it was. The administration, this administration, Trump administration, walked away from that agreement. But again, that agreement was not transformational. It was designed to deal with a very specific issue, which was how to delay and constrain Iran's aspirations to be able to become a nuclear weapons threshold state. That is to say, to have all the elements required to produce a weapon, but not to produce it, or to determine, they would determine when they would produce it. I see it's almost impossible to imagine now, 47 years after the Iranian Revolution, any meaningful diplomacy on the broader issue, which would allow a normal, peaceful relationship to develop between the United States and Tehran. We'll see how much longer this regime can last. I think that may well be the one takeaway from what we're watching now, that since Iran, the regime cannot satisfy the needs of its own people, it does not have the resources, and it is not interested in opening up, that it's only a matter of time before the streets of Tehran are flooded again. And at some point, perhaps, there will be fraction and fracture within the current regime, which could conceivably lead to change. But again, what kind of change? There isn't an Iranian analyst on the planet that could predict to you with any certainty or authority or precision where Iran would be headed.
Aaron, thank you very much for your expertise. I appreciate it, and have a good day.
Maxym, thank you so much.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.